The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain. Mark Twain, Samuel Langhorne Clemens, was born in Florida, Missouri on November 30th, 1835. His father, John Marshall Clemens, a lawyer originating from Virginia. His mother, Jane Lambton, from Kentucky. When he was 4, his family moved to Hannibal, Missouri, a small township on the Mississippi, where he continued to live until the age of 18. His formal education ended soon after his father's death in 1847, when he became a printer's apprentice, working for a time on the Missouri Courier under the editorship of his elder brother Arion. From 1853, he traveled widely as a journeyman printer in the eastern states and in the West. As a result of a steamboat journey down the Mississippi, he met Horace Bixby, the captain of the boat, and turned to a career on the river. After an apprenticeship of 1.5 years, he became a licensed pilot in 1859. He left the Mississippi at the outbreak of the Civil War and became in swift succession an Army volunteer, a gold prospector in Nevada, a timber speculator, and a journalist. He met Artemus Ward and Bret Harte during this time and turned increasingly towards a professional literary career. While working for the Virginia City Enterprise, he adopted the pseudonym Mark Twain, the cry of a boatman taking soundings and meaning 2 fathoms, i.e. 12 feet. The choice of name may have been characteristically ironic, since 2 fathoms was presumably an uncomfortable depth for a large steamboat. His first book, Jumping Frog, appeared in 1865. Assignments as a traveling reporter to the Sandwich Islands and then to the Mediterranean and Middle East brought him success as a public lecturer and also material for his first major literary success, Innocent Abroad, 1869. He married Olivia Langdon the following year and in 1875 published himself as a successful writer in a large mansion in Hartford, Connecticut. He continued to live there for the next 17 years. It was during this period that his most famous works were written: Roughing It, 1872, The Gilded Age, 1873, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, 1876, Life on the Mississippi, 1883, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, 1884 and 1885. He combined his writing with public lecturing and foreign traveling, becoming American ambassador at large and acquiring an international reputation. As a humorist cum frontier philosopher, he indulged in frequent financial speculation, particularly in typesetting machinery and the Charles L. Webster Publishing House. Although his literary reputation became increasingly secure, he received an M.A. of Yale in 1888. His intellectual pessimism and despair of human nature increased with his success. The Gilded Age, written in collaboration with C. Dudley Warner, had already pointed towards his uneasy acceptance of the values of 19th century American society. In the year of Pudd'nhead Wilson, 1894, he was bankrupted by the failure of both the typesetting and publishing companies and was compelled to restart his travel to raise the money to discharge his debts. It was during his absence on this voyage that his daughter Susie died. In 1898, the year that he cleared his debts, he wrote 3 works expressing his acute pessimism. The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg, published 1900. The Philosophizing Treatise, What is Man, published 1906, and The Mysterious Stranger, published posthumously in 1916. From this time until his death, he maintained a bitter skepticism, relieved at times by outraged commentary on world affairs, notably on Belgian atrocities in the Congo and American behavior in the Philippines. His last years were saddened by personal bereavement, his wife dying in 1904 and his daughter Jean in 1909. In 1906, he started preparing material for his autobiography, and in 1907 received an honorary doctorate of Oxford University. He died at Reading, Connecticut on April 21, 1910, at the age of 75. Introduction. In the late summer of 1883, at Quarry Farm, high above Elmira in southern New York State, Samuel Langhorne Clemens completed a work which, as he put it in a letter to his brother Aryan, he had been falling over for 7 years. That summer, however, he said it had been no more trouble to him to write than it had been to lie, going damp from the breakfast table each morning to the study he had built at the farm 9 years before. He gave his inspirational talent full rein, piling up manuscript in a really astonishing way, and incidentally, as his custom, was letting it fall on the floor about him as he wrote. In this way, at the age of 48, in the quietest of all quiet places, Mark Twain completed what many would accept as the greatest American novel, and certainly the most important novel of the American 19th century, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. It was indeed 7 years earlier, in July 1876, immediately after the publication of Tom Sawyer, that he began another boy's book. It was he wrote more to be at work than anything else. In a month 400 pages were written of Huck Finn's autobiography, as he called it, but then, when he thought it very nearly half done, he decided that he liked what he had written only tolerably well, and considered pigeonholing or burning the manuscript. This rushing at the work and becoming played out was nothing new to his talent. As long as a book would write itself, he once wrote, I was a faithful and interested amanuensis, but the minute that the book tried to shift to my head the labor of contriving its situations, I put it away. My tank had run dry. It so happened that this time his tank had run dry at a particularly difficult stage. He stopped composing probably for 3 years towards the end of what is now chapter 16. 7 years altogether of working by fits and starts were needed before he could complete the themes established in those first 16 chapters. In the summer of 1883, he had little conscious idea of the importance of the work he had created. In a letter to a friend, he called it no more than a kind of companion to Tom Sawyer. For all the exhilaration of that summer, he remained innocent of the scale of the work his imagination had strangely put together. Very few felt the power behind the picaresque, rather untidy story. For respectable America and the Library Committee of Concord, Massachusetts, was Representative Huckleberry Finn was rough, coarse, and intelligent, more suited to the slums than to intelligent, respectable people. In a phrase, it was the veriest trash to the less censorious. It seemed no more than a sequel to Tom Sawyer's second boyhood romance, set in the Mississippi Valley, some 40 to 50 years ago, written in the tradition of Southwestern humor to which, from the outset, Mark Twain's talents had been recruited. Certainly, the essential story is simple enough. A boy of about 13 or 14 decides to run away from the cruelties of a drunken father and the civilizing pressures of respectable St. Petersburg society. At the moment of escape, he falls in with Jim, Miss Watson's runaway slave. Together they make their way down the Mississippi on a raft brought down on the June rise, traveling over 1,000 miles to the Phillips plantation in Arkansas, where the novel has its ending. Only in this century has the importance of the novel created about this skeleton become generally accepted. That from this tale of the escape of the outcast son of the town drunkard of St. Petersburg, Missouri, Mark Twain created a novel which came in time to be recognized as the American classic. H. L. Mencken set the tone and scale of much later assessment when he declared it in 1913 one of the greatest masterpieces of the world, and asserted Twain's essential Americans, seeing him as the true father of our national heritage, the first genuinely American artist of the blood royal. This comes near to Hemingway's famous and characteristic testimony that all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain called Huckleberry Finn. It's the best book we've had. All American writing comes from that. There was nothing before. There has been nothing as good since. Although this kind of rhetoric doesn't get us very far, it serves to establish the scale of reference within which Huckleberry Finn has come to be discussed. Even though it has long been the subject of serious critical and sometimes adverse debate, the central position remains that any discussion of it, whether of its strength or weakness, begins from an assumption about its greatness. Bernard DeVos claimed that it has a vigor, a depth, and a multiplicity which no other American novel surpasses, if in fact any equals them. And T.S. Eliot's proposal that the character of Huckleberry Finn is one of the permanent symbolic figures of fiction, not unworthy to take a place with Ulysses, Fawcett, Don Quixote, Don Juan, Hamlet, and other discoveries which man has made about himself, set the radius of the circle which any account of the novel is called upon to inscribe. Mark Twain's vague intention in starting the book was indeed to write a kind of companion to Tom Sawyer. From the outset, Huckleberry Finn was the Tom Sawyer's comrade of the work's ultimate subtitle, and although the novel became in the course of 7 years writing something entirely other than the sequel of Tom Sawyer, Twain never moved away from the theme he first established. The novel was to be about a boy's adventures in the Mississippi Valley. Some 40 or 50 years ago, boyhood and the world of the old Mississippi before the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, were the twin points of concentration for Twain's imagination during the period 1874 to 1883. The recollected image of his own boyhood and adolescence in the small riverside town of Hannibal, Missouri, had enormous power over his mind. He retained in his memory a picture of it, he said, as clear and vivid as a photograph. It became the source for the St. Petersburg of both Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn. His recollection of the Mississippi was immeasurably enriched by his experience as a steamboat pilot during 4 years of his early manhood, 1857 to 1861. Hannibal and the Mississippi, with all the complexity and nostalgia of his response to them, became the continuous focus of his work from the time when he was involved in earnest with the writing of Tom Sawyer. In that year, 1874, he wrote the first installment of the reminiscing old times of the Mississippi, and in the year Tom Sawyer was completed, 1876, he started with Huckleberry Finn. 6 years later, before that last rush of creativity which saw the end of the novel, he revisited the river valley. It was his first prolonged visit since he left the Mississippi at the outbreak of the Civil War. Out of this spring visit in 1882 came life on the Mississippi and some at least of the great middle section of Huckleberry Finn. We now know that it was wrong to suppose that the visit caused him to take up the manuscript of the novel again, since he had already returned to it in the winter of 1879 to 1880. Nevertheless, the visit clarified his attitudes towards the river and made him acutely aware of what had been happening on the Mississippi since he left it in 1861. In itself, the visit is important evidence of his concern with the river during the years he was at work on Huckleberry Finn. Twain knew his own obsessions. He was entirely conscious of the power of boyhood and the Mississippi over his mind. In a letter of 1890 he wrote, "I confine myself to the life with which I am familiar. I confine myself to boy life out on the Mississippi, because that had peculiar charm on me. Now then, as the most valuable capital in the building of novels is personal experience, I ought to be well occupied." But then, in a crossed-through postscript, he added, "And yet I can't get away from the boyhood period and write novels because capital isn't sufficient by itself, and I lack the other essential interest in handling the men and experience of later times." Although he could write in an unmailed letters of 1876 to his close friend Will Bowen, that nostalgia was simply mental and moral masturbation. Nevertheless, his own nostalgic imagination flowed incessantly back to his own boy life out of the Mississippi and the lost piloting days of his early maturity. After all these years, he wrote in old times on the Mississippi. I can picture that old time just as it was then, the white town of Hannibal, drowsing in the sunshine of a summer's morning, the great Mississippi, the majestic, the magnificent Mississippi, rolling its mile-wide tide along. Thinking of that old day of his childhood in Hannibal made him feel, he wrote in letter of 1887, like some banished Adam revisiting his half-forgotten paradise and wondering how the arid world could ever have seemed green and fair to him. 4 days after his marriage, he wrote this to Bowen: "Your letter has stirred me to the bottom. The fountains of my great deep are broken up, and I have reigned reminiscences. The old life has swept before me. The old faces have looked out of the mists of the past, and the songs I loved ages and ages ago have come wailing down the centuries." Even 20 years after he left the river, he could write in Life on the Mississippi that he longed to be left to dream that the years hadn't slipped away, that there had been no war, no mining days, no literary adventures, that he was still a pilot, happy and carefree, as he had been 20 years before. A pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent being that lived on earth. Writers of all kinds are manacled servants of the public. We write frankly and fearlessly, but then we modify before we print. In truth, every man and woman and child has a master, and worries and frets in servitude, but in the day I write of the Mississippi pilot had none. This raises at once the problem of Twain's complicated and much discussed personality and the influence that this had upon his work. The idea of past was clearly associated for him with the idea of a lost freedom and a compromised integrity. Being a pilot was somehow freedom and integrity. All else was being manacled, being mastered, and being mastered meant the modification of rank and fearless statement by cowardice, masquerading as discretion. Huckleberry Finn was written out of Twain's concern with the problem of creative independence. It's a novel about freedom and integrity. It has been suggested that this concern bordered upon obsession, that an overstatement takes over in such passages as the above, indicating a personality laboring under restraint and inhibition, that under various psychic pressures his desire for the past and its freedom became merely longing for escape, that his wisdom and commentary as a novelist were almost everywhere blurred and vitiated by an insuperable regression. It was Van Wyck Brooks who first attempted an analysis of Mark Twain's complex and, for him, acutely disturbed personality in his The Ordeal of Mark Twain, 1920. He saw Twain's uncomfortable humor, his ironic self-recrimination, his growing misanthropy, which is already there, as a pressure, albeit a controlled pressure in Huckleberry Finn, as the morbid products of curbs imposed upon his personality. For Brooks, the civilizing pressures of his wife and New England literary friends curbed and belighted the vitialities of the frontier humor. The devitalizing general tradition of New England was at odds with the living warmth of that so essentially American phenomenon, the frontier. More important still, Brooks contended that Twain himself was discontented with his success, that he felt his talents as in some way squandered and compromised, that he regretted becoming the comic spokesman of a civilization whose values in part of him he deeply despised. Somewhere at the heart of Twain's talent, Brooks saw a hurt and a frustration in face of which Twain maintained the escape route of his boy life out on the Mississippi, recreated in the fantasy world of Tom Sawyer and his comrade Huckleberry Finn. He didn't, of course, question the greatness of Huckleberry Finn. There, at least, Twain's genius transmuted what was generally pervasive weakness into what was undeniably major art. Elsewhere, however, he saw Twain's talents continuously negated, with Huckleberry Finn itself hovering at times uncomfortably on the narrow frontier between triumph and failure. There's of course over-pleading in Brooks' case. He may well have been too much caught up in the psychologizing enthusiasms of his time, but for all the caveats and protests of his detractors, the acceptability of much of his position surely stands. Almost everywhere in Twain's work, even in Huckleberry Finn, there is the sense of a casual inspirational talent at work, happening almost accidentally upon its potentialities, for anyone not needing to adopt a position in the controversy. It's inconceivable not to admit that Brooks, with very considerable originality, cast valuable insights into the formation of Twain's personality and the source of his imaginative life, and with them the creation of Huckleberry Finn. Twain's relations with his wife Olivia Langdon, whom he married in 1870, have always been central to the controversy. But even if we discount the degree of inhibition which she exercised over his talent, it's difficult entirely to ignore the constant irony with which he referred to her. Even before their marriage, he could write, "But you will break up all my irregularities, when we are married and civilize me and make of me a model husband and an adornment to society, won't you? It would be deafness not to hear reverberations of this kind of thing in such passages as the following in Huckleberry Finn. The widow Douglas, she took me for her son, and allowed she would civilize me. And again in that famous last rebellious assertion of the novel. But I reckon I got to light out for the territory ahead of the rest, because Aunt Sally, she's going to adopt me and civilize me, and I can't stand it. I've been there before. The image of the reluctant son clung to his imagination. He once declared, the most difficult child his wife had had. Changing the metaphor, on another occasion he wrote, after my marriage she edited everything I wrote, and what's more, she not only edited my works, she edited me. Delancey Ferguson, one of the first to question Brock's theory of Mrs. Clemens inhibiting influences, has shown convincingly how little of the 3/5 of the original manuscript of Huckleberry Finn in Buffalo Public Library was affected by her censorship. Brock's, however, didn't, of course, suggest that the book was subjected to detailed comment. He accepted that it came out without very much of Levy's editing. He was more concerned with subtle patterns of conditioning and irritations built up by interventions and assumptions over the years. In face of all the discussion there has been about Mrs. Clemens's influence over her husband's work, it's useful perhaps to have the following from the childish autobiography of their daughter Susie. Papa read Huckleberry Finn to us in manuscript just before it came out, and then he would leave parts of it with Mama to expurgate, while he went off to the study to work. And sometimes Clara and I would be sitting with Mama while she was looking the manuscript over, and I remember so well with what pangs of regret we used to see her turn down the leaves of the pages, which meant that some delightfully terrible part must be scratched out. And I remember one part particularly, which was perfectly fascinating. It was so terrible, and oh, with what despair we saw Mama turn down the leaf of which it was written. We thought the book would almost be ruined without it, but we gradually came to think as Mama did. This last reminds one of the notices the family left about the house for Twain in his old age, telling him what not to do while they were out, and of his own remark, I have been used to obeying my family all my life. If we discount this kind of remark as kidding, we are returned to observed realities in the accounts of the Clemens household given in the journal of their close friend, Mrs. James T. Fields. On one occasion she wrote, his wife had told him to see how well we behaved, poor we, and he knew he had everything to learn. He was so amusing about it that he left us in a storm of laughter. Yet at bottom I could see it was no laughing matter to him. He's in dead earnest. One recalls a further note she made of an accident at Twain's Hartford mansion in 1876, the year he began Huckleberry Finn. He proceeded to speak of his autobiography, which he intends to write as fully and simply as possible to leave behind him. His wife laughingly said she would talk it over and leave out objectionable passages. No, he said, very earnestly, almost sternly, you are not to edit it. It's to appear as it was written, with the whole tale told as truly as I can tell it. This telling the whole tale truly remained a constant concern with Twain throughout his life. He envisaged a conventional autobiography, which he said on one occasion would be something awful. Paine, his original biographer, said that he confessed freely that he lacked the courage, even the ability to pen the words that would lay his soul bare, whatever the acutely personal element there may have been in his self-dissatisfaction. Part of his self-complaint lay in his abiding sense of literary failure and moral compromise. Although we can accept that in Huckleberry Finn he may well have written the great American novel that, far from having his talents impaired by the genteel tradition, he retained the fiber of his frontier experience and brought southwestern humor to its fullest expression. This wasn't exactly how Twain himself saw his career. That early exclamation to his friend is not to be ignored. "Oh, Cable, I am demeaning myself. I am allowing myself to be a mere buffoon. It's ghastly. I can't endure it any longer." His constant hope was that one day he would have done with literature wherewith to please the general public, that he would write a work to please himself, a book which should say my say right out of my heart, taking into account no one's feelings and no one's prejudice, a book without reserves. This wish to tell the whole tale, truly to say my say, right out of my heart, bore directly upon the writing of Huckleberry Finn, for the immediate theme struck by the novel is truth in a way which hasn't always impressed itself upon its critics. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. The book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. No great novel can have had a stranger opening nor a stranger ending, for when the work is over, it's consigned to the reader with the end. Yours truly, Huck Finn. It seems reasonable to take the point that whereas Tom Sawyer told the truth, mainly Huckleberry Finn had told it truly. The inescapable inference is that here in Huckleberry Finn, Twain had said truly what it was he wanted to say. Twain's sense of moral compromise arose in part from the fact that he wrote to please, and therefore to endorse, a society whose values he at least partially deplored. There was a painful ambiguity between his assured success as a humorous writer, and that is exactly how he was seen, and his, in most opinions, about 19th century American civilization. Behind his public success, he harbored savagely dissident opinions against the society he wrote to amuse and which in turn lionized him. Like so many novelists of the century, like Dickens, George Eliot, and Tolstoy, his intentions were essentially moralizing. Huckleberry Finn is a novel of moral protest, a dissident work at odds with the dominant values of late 19th century America. For although part of Twain worshipped the gods of Northern industrial progress, another part of him was entirely aware of and regretted its cost. For the Mark Twain that was concerned with moral rather than with material values, the 19th century in both Europe and America had seen a vast change in ideals. All Europe and America are feverishly scrambling for money. Money lust has always existed, but not in the history of the world was it ever a madness until your time and mine. This lust has rotted these nations. It has made them hard, sordid, ungentle, dishonest, oppressive. On an important level, Huckleberry Finn is about money. The germ of the work lies in the fact that the possession of money exposes Huck to the civilizing ministrations of the widow Douglas, against which he rebels, and that her sister Miss Watson couldn't resist the 800 corrupting dollars offered her by the nigger trade. For her Negro Jim, the king and duke perform their monstrous frauds for money alone, and finally betray him for significantly $40. Twain's whole pessimistic analysis of man's social nature in the episodes of the great middle section of the novel derives largely from the lust which rots and which makes men hard, sordid, ungentle, dishonest, oppressive. For Twain, however, the most damaging count against society was its suppression of what he himself termed natural and healthy instincts. We have no real morals, he once said, but the forced suppression of natural and healthy instincts. The story of Huck and Jim's life on the raft in Huckleberry Finn is about the freedom of natural and healthy instinct. In this, it clearly lies within the whole movement of the major literary sensibility from the close of the 18th century, within the revolt of instinct and feeling against the rationalism and mentality of the Enlightenment. With the raft in Huckleberry Finn, we are close to the rejection of civilization inherent in the noble savagery of Rousseau and the 18th century cult of man's primitive innocence. It's related to that romantic tradition which saw a tension between human innocence and social experience, which Blake so importantly expressed in Huckleberry Finn. There is an implied conflict between the life on the raft and the corruptions worked upon it by the power of society. In its serious meaning, it has to do with that fissure between man and society and between nature and civilization, which grew ever wider in the literary imagination from the close of the 18th century, and which became the basis of the dominant romantic critique of 19th century industrial and urban society. The English romantics, one thinks of Blake and Wordsworth, had often taken the child as the symbol of human intuitive joy, and nature had been his habitat. Twain's personal involvement with boy life out on the Mississippi provided him with the image through which he could express this conflict between man in nature pursuing the spontaneous morality of the heart and man in society corrupted by money lust and a repressive morality. The Mississippi for Twain wasn't only the habitat of his own early unfettered years, but the habitat of all unfettered natural and healthy instinct everywhere. And in this, it's important to remember what had happened to the Mississippi during Mark Twain's lifetime and his response to it. There was always his wish, expressed in Life on the Mississippi, that there had been no war. The Civil War not only saw the end of Mark Twain's own piloting, it proved no less the end of all times on the river itself. The traffic of the great continental waterway was disrupted by war, and then with the peace in 1865, the leisurely transit of steamboat and trading scow gave way increasingly to the commercial realities of faster and faster railroad schedules. The steamboat, and with it the life of the old Mississippi, receded into legend, becoming in time the symbol of an older lost America submerged beneath the commercial progress of a triumphant North. Twain's response to this and to the whole shift of 19th century American society was complex and often ambiguous. Part of him loved the humanity and warmth of the old Mississippi and deplored the march of progress down the river valley, but part of him equally detested the decadence of the old aristocratic South and admired the material efficiencies of northern commerce and industry. His position in all its ambiguity comes out clearly enough in Life on the Mississippi, written out of the experience of his visit. Life on the Mississippi, written out of the experience of his visit to the river in the spring of 1882. The visit exposed the unresolved conflict between his sympathies for certain qualities in the life of the Old South and his enthusiasm for certain of the values of the triumphant North. He was deeply committed to Northern ideologies, to its progressivism and its egalitarian politics, and this part of him maintained a deep honesty towards the Old South. The visit of 1882 broke through more acutely than ever before his nostalgic image of the old river. He received a clear sense of what the Hannibal of his youth had been really like, stripped of all the rosy prevarications of selective memory. He saw Southern society as fatally enmeshed in its medieval aristocratic past, rotten with fictions and dreams. As he moved upriver into aliens and the Northwest away from the southern Mississippi, he admired the enlivening signs of the presence of active, energetic, intelligent, prosperous, practical 19th century populations. The people don't dream, he added, they work. This antithesis had deep meaning for Twain. The decadence of the South for him was that it dreamed, that it had no hold on realities, far from Huck and Jim's society on the raft, assuming for Twain a dreamlike, escapist quality. He in fact always asserts the reality of the raft against the unreality of the world surrounding and invading it. Huck sets his face against the dream world of Tom Sawyer's imagination and against the divorce of language and life in the conventions of St. Petersburg morality. Huckleberry Finn deals in large part with the demoralizing power of language to anesthetize and control the human mind through causing it to dream. The appealing power of the king and duke over the little riverside townships, for example, lies in their ability to exploit the fatal human preference to the gulled by words, to live by moral rhetoric alone rather than by the moralizing experience of life. In this power of language to sustain a social dream, Twain was especially concerned with the corrupting power of romantic fiction, typified for him in the medieval novels of Walter Scott. For Twain, the purging from men's social imagination of decadent aristocratic myth had been largely achieved at the beginning of the 17th century by Cervantes' Don Quixote. The process had, he thought, been fatally reversed in the southern states by the medievalizing nonsense of Walter Scott. Don Quixote had been overcome by Ivanhoe. The first Don Quixote swept the world's admiration for the medieval chivalry silliness out of existence, and the other, Ivanhoe, restored it. As far as our South is concerned, the good work done by Cervantes is pretty nearly a dead letter, so effectually has Scott's pernicious work
undermined it. Scott's influence, he declared, had checked the wave of progress in the South, remained in love with dreams and phantoms, with decayed and swinish forms of religion, with decayed and degraded systems of government, with the silliness, emptinesses, sham grandeurs, sham goods, and sham chivalries of a brainless and worthless, long vanished society. For Twain, monarchy and aristocracy could only survive in a modern society by proliferating myth.
Out of all this comes the account of the feud of the aristocratic Grainerfords and Chevertons in Huckleberry Finn, and the fraudulent king and duke who, for all their comedy and for all Huck's final compassion for them, remain creations of frightfulness and fear. Twain's hostility towards Southern society was sharpened by his visit to the river in 1882, but it had always been there in his memory of Hannibal, jostling with his idealizing nostalgia. This hostility became the basis for the negative case of the novel, for the conflict that lies at the heart of the work between the society of Huck and Jim on the raft and the corrupt civilization along the Mississippi's banks. But as he traveled the river during that spring of 1882, Twain sensed something entirely other, equally important for the creation of Huckleberry Finn, beyond his distaste for the dreaming South and beyond his admiration for those 19th century populations. From St. Louis northward, he saw a further reality, the river he had known as a boy in Hannibal and as a pilot in those years just before the Civil War had become ironically the victim of the processes of the civilization he so much admired as a symbol of creative life, of man in spontaneous association with nature. The river was being destroyed. Everything he found had changed with Hannibal. The romance of boating had gone now. Hannibal had in fact become an important railroad center. The navigation lights on the river knocked the romance out of piloting, he said. These mechanisms of the federalizing North symbolized the situation. They superseded the old wisdoms, the old intimacies between man and river. Steamboatmen could no longer be gods in the word of the machine. Perhaps most ominously of all, he realized that the youth don't talk river slang anymore. The rafts no longer floated leisurely along in the old-fashioned way, manned with joyous and reckless crews, fiddling, song-singing, whiskey-drinking. Instead, their crews were now quite orderly men of a sedate business aspect, with not a suggestion of romance about them anywhere. He wrote to his wife, "The world I knew in its blossoming youth is old and bowed and melancholy now. Its soft cheeks are leathery and wrinkled. The fire is gone out of its eyes, and the spring from its step. It will be dust and ashes when I come again. I have been clasping hands with the moribund." His personal nostalgia for his boyhood and piloting days fused with significant regret for what was happening to American civilization, for all the gain in materialities. He sensed that these were being achieved at cost. In The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Twain gave American expression to a tradition of thought which had frequently haunted the European mind since the Renaissance, the longing for a retreat from knowledge, from mentality, and ultimately from civilization itself. Huckleberry Finn is part of that important tradition which saw the development of modern civilization as in some way at odds with the creative sources of life itself. Twain's experience of the Mississippi enabled him to convey in marvelously concrete terms this problem of the 19th century predicament. Huckleberry Finn asserts the values of individualized experience against the threatening incubes of civilization. It's this which makes it so much more than a kind of companion to Tom Sawyer's, which makes it, in fact, one of the great modern novels. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. One might say that Mark Twain came to write Huckleberry Finn twice, and that the first time he failed and wrote Tom Sawyer instead.